Welcome to Kitchen Table Finance.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
Doing very well, all things considered. The sun is shining. It looks
Yeah,
like we will get a little bit of a spring here
maybe,
before summer.
maybe.
But all things considered, doing pretty good.
All right.
We have another episode kind of in our series. So this last month we had really kind of focused on retirement income. And today's discussion is all about when and how to potentially adjust your income in retirement and what that means. And I think of it in a couple different ways, just like the functionality of understanding like the dynamics behind when you should be making these decisions and potentially changing your income, but also I love the exercise of like thinking through and visualizing what it means to have a potentially bad market, which, we're kind of seeing the beginnings of that right now and what that potentially means to your retirement income.
Yeah. For those of you listening to this like in the moment, like in the next week or two when we release this, we did not plan this to coincide with a market downturn. It just worked out that way. I like to think there's no causality there. Like, hey, Dave and Nick are going to talk about how to adjust your portfolio. Let's have a bear market.
Right.
But it's timely.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up because it's funny. Obviously, I listen to a lot of podcasts, and like lately, all of the market economic update ones are like, "We are having this conversation at 11:52."
Right. Let's timestamp it. Yeah.
It's by the time you listen to it, things will have changed.
Right.
So yes, things will have changed by the time you listen to this.
Well,
and it is not a direct representation of the current market.
Yeah. Well, two things there that I think are germane. One is we're pretty good at this conversation right now because we've been having it a lot with clients.
Yeah.
And two, really what we have to say today, like I started this, we didn't time this to coincide. We chose this topic 2 months ago and we laid out our calendar for the year. It's based on principles that apply bull markets, bear markets, and that's a lot of the conversations we've been having lately with clients during volatility, whether it's about income directly or not, have been about sticking to your principles during volatile times. And so in keeping with that, if you lay out the rules for how you're going to think about your income before you need to think about your income, you'll be able to make better decisions, less emotion involved. You'll have thought through, hey, if I cut back my spending by X during, a pull down of Y in my account value, then, you've already done the lifeboat drill, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think of it too, obviously, we focus a lot on the downside, which I do think is very beneficial for people. Loss aversion is a real thing. Like more people are worried about losing money than they are about not gaining and, not gaining as much. Yeah. And so, but there's the flip side of this conversation too, which is like, when can you start spending more money and what does that mean to your plan? And are you, there's that whole conversation around you're spending X, you really could be spending Y and have similar outcomes.
And if we get to the bottom of our little outline for today, we're going to talk a little bit about some decision making in history. And most of the historical scenarios, even during rough markets, end up with you being able to spend, if you carry it out through your retirement, being able to spend much more than you had projected at the beginning, just because that's the way the markets have worked.
Yeah. So this whole conversation about income really kind of starts about thinking about spending, and there's really two parts to that, right?
Yeah. And in simple terms, think of basic necessary spending during retirement. What pays your bills and puts food on your table? And what is discretionary spending, fun stuff, travel, things that you want to do, but if push came to shove, could be delayed a few years, could be downsized, if not eliminated completely.
Yeah, and I think that exercise just in whole is really good for people like heading into retirement and good to kind of revisit every couple of years. Because obviously that stuff changes, but it really does give you a good idea of, in a sense of like, okay, worst case scenario, if we didn't travel and do the fun stuff, like we're going to be okay. We still, we have way more potential income than what our discretionary or than what our basic needs are, right?
Right.
So from there, right, like the big thing that we kind of are focusing on now is that, the whole idea behind loss aversion and how to deal with, prolonged market downturn
Hmm.
and what that potentially means for your income.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very contextual, right? So
Hmm.
how much of your spending is necessary versus discretionary? How much of your necessary spending is covered by fixed income sources like Social
Right.
Security, pensions, and what does your required withdrawal rate look like from your portfolio? Is it safe and sustainable? Is it
Yeah.
something that is maybe built on good market returns, but not necessarily realistic in terms of
Right.
sequence of returns?
And I think there's too some work on the front end of like, okay, what are my sustainable income sources? And do I feel confident in that? Or do I need
Hmm.
to potentially look at ways to increase those sustainable sources? Right.
Right.
So, not everybody and most people fall into this category of not having a pension, but that doesn't mean you can't, create a pension through an annuity or a fixed source. And this really kind of comes back to that idea of how conservative slash aggressive are you
Hmm.
personality wise, and how that plays into like looking at withdrawal rates and how your comfort level as things happen of
Yeah.
whether or not that might be something that is beneficial to, there's always a cost to that, but, the reward sometimes is being able to sleep at night.
Yeah. Right. Right. And so, there's ways to create more fixed income sources if you need to. There are also ways to think about your portfolio allocation in terms of how much volatility you have,
Hmm.
how much do you need to make on your money. What we like to see is that required withdrawal rate be a relatively low number, at least on average throughout retirement. And then the discretionary number can, be a little bit more, but
Yeah.
that's because that can be turned off.
Then we get into this, the problem, if you will, of a down market, right? And that is, everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people are familiar with the concept of dollar cost averaging, of like
Yeah.
putting money into the market, and volatility is kind of your friend there, because when
Right.
markets go down, you're buying more shares every month. And that is a good thing when markets go back up, right?
Right. You
But
have
it
more
kind of works
shares
in,
to participate.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. But it works in reverse when you're taking money out and making sales in order to generate income from your portfolio, right?
exactly. Exactly.
And so every month, then we're selling more shares to maintain that same withdrawal amount. And depending on how much volatility will kind of really depend on, how much recovery you need on the flip side of that, right? And that's like the
Yeah.
big fear or worry. If you're selling too much into a down market, then it's just going to make that recovery, percentage that you need to get even more. And then it, creates this sense of fear of what if I, spend too much on the way down and don't ever make it back up on the flip side, right?
Yeah.
I think that's something that people consider and worry about. And so, there's a couple different potential solutions to that and ways to think about that. And I think the first one is done on the front end of like figuring out what your withdrawal rate is
Yeah.
and
Come
making
up with
sure you're in a
something.
safe.
Yeah. Yeah. Something that is sustainable,
Right.
and there's some tools out there on the internet you can use for free to come up
Hmm.
with sustainable withdrawal rates. There's also the old rule of thumb, if you're in your mid 60s and nearing retirement, you can expect to spend about 4% of your retirement portfolio in that for starting with that first year, and be able to increase that every year for inflation, yet still plan on the market sustaining that through your lifetime.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the reasons when we're creating retirement income plans, we're using tools like Monte Carlo simulators
Hmm.
that basically will, walk us through all of the different scenarios in terms of, they run 1,000 different scenarios for all the potential
Right.
sequence of returns so that we have a good understanding of, most of the time we're in the confidence zone as far as like the impact of
Yeah.
those sequence of returns, right? And so
Right.
every
Right.
plan that we create is always with the idea in mind that the market's not going to go straight up,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
There's going to be bad times, and we want to know how that potentially impacts your retirement income. And I guess, the thing that you have to really assess, especially if you're doing this on your own, is how sensitive is your income to changes in the market, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
what percentage of income do you have coming from fixed income sources versus coming from your portfolio
Right.
versus coming from, cash or safe assets that don't fluctuate with the market. Like all of that plays into how much of a problem this actually may be for you.
Yeah. To talk in generalities here for the listening audience, I guess we make some assumptions that you're probably somewhere in a moderate portfolio, and that if you're starting in your mid 60s, your withdrawal rate should probably be somewhere around 4%. And then, so one way you can think about how market volatility would affect that, we should pause for a second because we've been dealing with this a lot the last couple of weeks. When the market goes down, the first thing that comes through most people's minds is, oh my gosh, I've got to cut all my discretionary spending. That's usually an overreaction, unless you
Right.
were already in trouble to begin with. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're already overspending, then yes, that may be true. But if you were making what is normally, in the neighborhood of safe withdrawals, you probably don't have to make drastic changes.
Mm-hmm.
One thing you can do, back to that withdrawal rate is your annual distribution amount divided by your portfolio. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you've got $1 million portfolio and you're taking $4,000 a month, that's a 4.8% withdrawal rate, right?
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
a little higher than that 4% rule of thumb, but definitely within the realm, especially if some of those expenses are discretionary, that's within the realm of where you can anticipate that it should be safe with some
Right.
finesse. So, if you're worried about that, say you started the year with $1 million in your portfolio and a 4.8% withdrawal rate, and 6 months down the road, and I should get my calculator out here before I say anything more, say your portfolio is worth 800,000 and you're still taking 48,000, that makes your withdrawal rate 6% instead of
Yeah.
4.8. So
Right.
that is now probably an unsustainable withdrawal rate. So if we
Mm-hmm.
were to take 800,000,
I love this. We're doing math on the
yeah,
fly
I know,
here.
right? I should have just quit while I was ahead.
This is
800,000.
this is how the magic happens.
Yeah. My mom is probably like just rolling over right now. So say 4.8% was still your target, that would be 38,400 now
Mm-hmm.
of 800,000.
Yeah.
So some sort of reduction that gets you back closer to that withdrawal rate is probably
Right.
what you should look at. That may seem drastic, but if you've taken the step of looking at your budget, going from $4,000 a month to, here we go again, about 3,200 a month.
Yeah.
That's an $800 a month reduction. It's most likely temporary, right? Because then when the
Right.
market goes back up, you can do that same math again and come up with a kind of a new number as you go back up.
A couple things come to mind, and this is why I love having these conversations before the market starts going down.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like mentally, like if you're thinking, "Wow, cutting $800 from my expenses is going to be a real tough pill to swallow," right? Like maybe we start instead of 4%, maybe we start at a little bit lower because that
Yeah.
helps, right?
Yeah.
That helps smooth things out, and also it depends on the asset allocation of your portfolio, right? Like if
Right.
you're a more balanced portfolio, the chances of the portfolio going down 20%
That'd
is,
be a
significantly reduced.
big move. Right. I think my simple example maybe exaggerates it a little bit,
Yeah,
but
for sure.
but
But I think the idea is good of like how to
yeah,
start thinking through some of this stuff.
yeah, yeah, and that's really what we're doing, is just trying to work towards a framework on when you might need to make those considerations.
Yeah, for sure. And and the other thing too, we keep talking about potentially changing your income downward, but I also like running these scenarios for people who aren't spending as much as they probably could, because the chances of us hitting that lower guardrail are very, very slim in that regard. And
Yes.
so that hopefully, like, I just kind of see through the people that are having these conversations and thinking about these things of like, the market's down, I got to cut my spending when they don't necessarily need to, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's the
They're
last thing that
already
you
underspending. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those are usually the first ones that want to like cut spending, and that's not
Usually.
necessarily,
And we've
you
talked
know.
about the psychology behind retirement spending before, and it's exactly the people that underspend that are going to also, their gut instinct is, boy, I can't spend anything now.
I think that's a useful exercise in a lot of ways. And it just really kind of helps people visualize and think through things. In a lot of the scenarios that we're running with people that are in that, 3-4% withdrawal rate, when we actually do hit that guardrail, it's pretty small in terms of what that actual income adjustment is usually.
Yeah.
Your example was a little extreme, which is fine. But for a lot of people, especially if your spending is a little bit more in line or closer to that 3 to 4% range, usually I've been surprised by how small that adjustment actually is.
Yeah. So I was using an example of just getting back to your target withdrawal rate. When we do this with clients, we're using some pretty sophisticated software that's using kind of a dynamic approach to the markets and doesn't normally necessitate as big an adjustment. It depends on the client. It depends on what their sources of income are and their tolerance for risk. But there's usually quite a bit of leeway one way or the other once we've set a plan up.
Yeah.
And so in our software, just as an example, I set up that same base case with a couple with $1 million portfolio at 65 and retired. And from their portfolio, the system is suggesting a $4,000 a month withdrawal rate, so 4.8% with that $1 million portfolio. If the portfolio was to rise to 1,140,000, they could
Mm-hmm.
increase that spending to 4,530 a year. But if the
Mm-hmm.
portfolio fell to 6.35, I'm sorry, 635,000 from a million, that's a 33% drop. They would have to cut their spending back, but only by about $200 a month.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's not nearly as drastic as moving it back just to get that withdrawal rate the same.
Yeah. Right. For sure. Another thought that just kind of came to mind too, Dave, is if you think about it in terms of like the worry, fear factor in a down market, this is, again, one of those things. And we just did an episode, a kind of a bonus episode on this. So if you haven't heard that one, definitely check it out. But it's one of those things that you can potentially control. And so if cutting back a little bit on some of that discretionary stuff when the market's going down and you're watching your portfolio go down, helps you sleep at night, like that's a really,
Yeah.
that's a much better potential outcome than changing your asset allocation or moving to cash or one of those other potential gut reactions to some of this stuff, right?
Yeah. And we've talked about this before too, but anecdotally, at least, we both saw that with clients during the great financial crisis that
Yeah.
what would have sounded like a horribly painful cut in spending in 2006, if we had asked them about it, in 2008 just came naturally. Like, oh yeah, of course we're not going to take that
Right.
trip to Aruba this year. We can wait.
Yeah.
We'll do that when the market's better. And whether they needed to or not, kind of beside the point. Psychologically, that was the right choice for them because it meant that gave them some distance from the portfolio.
Yeah.
And boy, in terms of like the swing, wow, I feel a little funny, the way we're always talking about how most people that we work with underspend. This the difference between cutting your spending and letting the market recover versus trying to jump in and out of the market and time things in terms of what that'll mean for your future is
Yeah.
so much more reliable
Oh
and
yeah.
so much more impactful in a good way, most
Yeah.
likely. So,
Absolutely. 100%. So another thing in closing here is, that we like to do with the software we have is just go back in history and be like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
what would
So,
have happened in real time if we were in, 2007, for example,
so
right?
that same couple with $1 million portfolio, if they were retiring in mid 2007, right before the start of the financial crisis, they would indeed have had to cut back their income in early 2009, they would have hit that bottom guardrail where our system would have said, hey, their portfolio has fallen enough. At that point, it would have been down to the 666,000,
Okay.
give or take,
Gotcha.
followed by about 33%. This is also assuming like a 60% stock portfolio, so there's other assumptions involved. But they would have had to have cut their income back by a couple $100 a month from 2009, and it would have stayed in this example. It would have stayed about the same, adjusting up for inflation every year until sometime in early 2016. But at that point, they would have, because the market not only recovered but then grew substantially. By 2025, their planned income in today's dollars would be $5,750 a month.
Yeah.
So, back to where you started talking about how, like, you also need to think about when you can increase your income. Their plan that at retirement sustained $4,000 a month sustains an inflation adjusted $5,750 a month, 20 some years down the road. We can also look at other periods in time real quick. Just I liked the stagflation era because that's one of the concerns people have about where we are right now. So that would have been retiring in late 1968 and then running forward 30 years. Portfolio would have dropped pretty steady, but would not have hit the guardrails where we would have expected to have to cut their income until we get into the early 80s.
Yeah.
So basically, income would have been inflation adjusted, but stayed pretty flat for almost 14 years. And then in 1980, they would have to cut income. In 1982, they would have had to cut income by a couple $100 a month. But by mid 1986, it had jumped back to where it was before that, and then was nothing but increases through the 90s.
Okay.
So while history is never going to be perfect at this, it does give us some context for how plans would have behaved in different regimes. And what we see is basically throughout the last couple 100 years of history, modest cuts. If you start with modest cuts to your income when the market warrants it, if you started with a decent sustainable withdrawal rate in the first place, keeps you in pretty good shape.
Yeah. Which, is a great way, especially as you're approaching retirement or shortly after retirement, to just think through this stuff so that kind of what your potential worst case scenarios are and whether or not you feel comfortable with that so that you can potentially adjust before you get to that point, right? Because the easiest way to make sure that you don't hit those guardrails potentially is to adjust on the front end as opposed to waiting until you're, deep into it, right?
Yeah.
I actually had a great idea, and it involves me delegating to our associate advisor Cole. So that's what he gets for not joining the show today. But I'm gonna try to get him to put together a video that we'll throw up on YouTube, just walking through those scenarios, because I think the visuals are pretty helpful there too.
Yeah.
So if our listeners are interested in seeing like a hands-on of that software, and kind of how it works and what that looks like, I think that'd be super helpful. So.
Yeah, that'd be good.
I mean, all in favor, say aye, right?
Aye. I'm all for it. Let's give Cole something to do. I think we can tell him we don't need it until noon on Monday.
Yeah,
1 o'clock,
perfect.
maybe.
So look forward to that on our YouTube channel. And then if you have any questions or retirement income scenarios you're curious about, feel free to reach out at info@srbadvisors.com. We love having those conversations and look forward to it. As always, been a pleasure, Dave.
It's been fun. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you for joining us for another chat about your retirement and finances. Please hit that subscribe button. You can also contact us at srbadvisors.com or email us at info@srbadvisors.com. See you next time on Kitchen Table Finance.
This is a Zedia Media production.